Hello everybody and welcome to APES topic 1.4, the carbon cycle. Our learning objectives are today to explain the steps on reservoir interactions in the carbon cycle, specifically focusing on how the carbon cycle is the movement of atoms and molecules containing the element carbon between sources and sinks. Some of the reservoirs in which carbon compounds occur in the carbon cycle hold those compounds for long periods of time, sometimes millions of years, while some hold them for relatively short periods of time. Carbon cycles between photosynthesis and cellular respiration and living things, and plant and animal decomposition have led to the storage of carbon over millions of years. The burning of fossil fuels quickly moves that stored carbon into atmospheric carbon into the form of carbon dioxide. Now, all species are composed of carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus, and water. These atoms and molecules are critical for the functioning of species and ecosystems. Other elements are also required, such as calcium, magnesium, potassium, and sulfur, as well as a list of others. When it comes to ecosystems, all ecosystems combined represent a closed system, meaning that these atoms and molecules are not lost or gained, but instead cycle within or among ecosystems in different forms. So what we're going to be looking at over the next couple weeks are biogeochemical cycles. And what this means, or what we're talking about here, is that we're talking about the movement of matter within and between ecosystems involves a cycle of biological, geological, and chemical processes. So we're going to be looking at how it cycles not just between living things, but between non-living, so abiotic and biotic. The components of the cycle that contain matter are reservoirs. So each reservoir can serve as a source of the element when atoms and molecules leave that reservoir, or they can serve as a sink when the atoms and molecules get stored in the reservoir. And again, they can store them for different amounts of time. It could be millions of years, it could be just minutes. So carbon cycles moves carbon between the air, water, and land. Most important element in living organisms. You watch science fiction, they often refer to humans as carbon-based life forms. Makes up about 20% of our body weight. Carbon helps store energy, create structural aspects of cells, such as the cell membrane and cell wall, as well as make up the backbone of different proteins. Processes in the carbon cycle are categorized as either fast or slow. So if we're talking about a fast process, we're saying that it involves processes that are associated with living organisms that hold carbon for a short amount of time. And again, we're talking short being a relative term. So this includes the exchange of carbon dioxide between the air and water and the combustion of organic carbon, which releases CO2 into the atmosphere. We'll explore these a little more in a bit. Slow processes involve carbon that is held in rocks, soils, or as petroleum hydrocarbons, materials we use for fossil fuels, and it can be stored in this way for millions of years. And again, our species hasn't even been around for 1 million years, let alone millions of years. So here is just a brief picture of what we're going to be looking at through the carbon cycle. This picture is available in your notes for you to reference. So carbon sinks and sources. Carbon sinks are, again, a carbon reservoir that stores more carbon than it releases, such as the ocean, algae, living things that are going to store this, as well as sediments, sedimentary rock, which we'll talk about in a little bit, plants and soil. And carbon sources are going to be processes that add carbon to the atmosphere, especially in large amounts. Fossil fuel combustion, which is the combustion of oil, coal, or natural gas, as well as the performance of modern-day animal, especially industrialized animal agriculture. Deforestation is going to be a large part of this as well. So there's 7 processes that guide the carbon cycle. We have photosynthesis, respiration, exchange, sedimentation, burial, extraction, and combustion. We're going to take a little look at each one of these. So this goes back to when we were talking about photosynthesis and respiration, back when you were taking biology as a freshman. Now, photosynthesis acts as a carbon sink. It's performed by plants and algae on land or in water. Again, they're autotrophic, and they use solar energy to convert carbon dioxide, CO2, and water, H2O, into glucose, C6H12O6, and oxygen gas, which is O2. A portion of this energy is consumed by herbivores and subsequently predators, and we'll get into that in a couple topics. Aerobic respiration is a carbon source, so it's just going to release carbon back into the atmosphere. Organisms, plant and animals both, return a portion of their carbon as CO2 into the atmosphere. Cells convert/break down glucose and oxygen into energy, CO2, and water. Additional carbon is returned to the cycle after the organisms die. So that's what we were talking about with biomes. We talked about decomposition rates. That's the importance of it. Carbon that was part of live biomass reservoir, aka the living organisms, becomes part of the dead biomass reservoir. decomposes break down dead material, which returns CO2 to the water and air via respiration, and short-term cycle between the two processes balances each other out. So in general, there's a balance between photosynthesis and respiration in terms of the amount of carbon dioxide taken into living things and the amount released into the atmosphere. We're going to see that's referred to as a steady state. So again, photosynthesis is going to take in light energy and carbon dioxide, releasing sugar and oxygen. Cellular respiration is going to take in oxygen and release carbon dioxide. Now it's also going to be taking in sugar. Exchange, sedimentation, and burial. So carbon is exchanged between the atmosphere and the ocean. The amount of carbon released into the atmosphere from the ocean is approximately equal to the amount that diffuses into the ocean water. Some of the CO2 dissolved in the ocean enters the food web via photosynthesis by algae. Another portion of the dissolved CO2 combines with calcium ions in the water to form calcium carbonate, CaCO3. This is a precipitate, meaning that it's two liquids coming together or ions coming together to form a solid. This is a precipitate that forms limestone and dolomite rock via sedimentation and then burial. This is a slow process that takes place over millions and millions of years for buildup. So it accumulates all this carbon over millions of years at the bottom of the ocean. It created the largest carbon reservoir in the slow part of the carbon cycle, and it increased CO2 in the ocean. Increased CO2 in the ocean can lead to ocean acidification. So it's good that the carbon can be stored in terms of sedimentation. But that's one of the risks with climate change that we're facing: is increased ocean acidification in congruence with increased ocean temperature. Sedimentation and burial. Small fraction of the organic carbon in the dead biomass reservoir is buried in the ocean sediments before it can decompose. The organic matter can then become fossilized. It sinks down to the bottom of the ocean and is crushed to dust by the pressure there. So over millions of years, it can become fossil fuels as it builds up because we have very concentrated forms of carbon all in one place. The amount of carbon removed from the food web is a slow process. It is roughly equivalent to the amount of carbon returned to the atmosphere by weathering rocks containing carbon, again in the form of limestone, and by volcanic eruptions. Thus, the slow part of the carbon cycle is a steady state. Remember, that means that there is a balance. The input amount of carbon equals the output. Therefore, there's a neutral overall exchange. Extraction and combustion. So extraction of fossil fuels by humans is a relatively recent development. It's in the forms of coal, oil, and natural gas. And extraction itself does not alter the carbon cycle, but combustion does. Combustion. Humans burning fossil fuels, mainly, again, due to, like in terms of like individuals, it's usually our biggest consumption of oil is going to be, or fossil fuels is through internal combustion engine found in our cars. Now, natural combustion of carbon by fires or volcanoes also happens. This releases carbon into the atmosphere as CO2 or into the soil as ash. And respiration and decomposition are biotic processes that can actually increase this as well. Combustion is an abiotic process, meaning that, again, it's not living things contributing to this. Again, it's humans burning fossil fuels, but the humans' bodies themselves are not going to be the ones producing this carbon dioxide. It's coming from an action that the humans are undertaking, but it's still an abiotic process. A car running, like burning fossil fuels, is not a biotic process. Now, why is carbon especially important to what we're talking about? Earth's atmosphere is going to allow light energy from the sun to pierce through it. Some is reflected and some passes through it. Some energy is absorbed and the rest is going to be emitted as heat. So the Earth is able to absorb some energy, the energy is retained in the atmosphere, and the rest is just re-radiated out into space. Now, greenhouse gases in the atmosphere can absorb this heat, and we want a certain level of greenhouse gases to be there because they help the Earth retain some heat, and it's the heat that life on Earth is adapted to. Again, not just talking about humans, but other species are adapted to this amount of heat being in the atmosphere. If it increases dramatically or decreases dramatically, it's going to have an impact not just on humans, but on all life forms. So this helps keep the Earth a certain temperature. Now, carbon dioxide input from humans increased greatly after the Industrial Revolution, for many reasons, talking about natural production, increased factory production. Fossil fuels, in terms of a source of energy, was a huge game changer in terms of the economy. Now, natural greenhouse effect, again, we take in some energy and whatever is beyond what our atmosphere can handle is just re-radiated out into the space. However, when we have increased greenhouse gases such as carbon dioxide, more of that energy is retained, and that leads to a larger warming effect on the Earth, which, as we'll see throughout the year, has various implications on different climates. Basically, there's no climate that's unaffected by these rising global temperatures. Now, if we look at it, it doesn't seem like we're talking about a lot. Like, oh, it's going up 2 degrees Fahrenheit or 1 degree Celsius. It seems like, oh, that's not a lot, but we're talking about on a global planetary scale. So for on a global planetary scale, that much energy to heat up an entire planet 1 degree Celsius on average is an immense amount of energy and is only increasing and is only going to have further and further implications in all facets of not just of humans and human civilization, but of all life forms on Earth. Many species have already gone extinct and will never come back due to climate change, the effects that we've already felt thus far. And these numbers, going back to the 1850s, are corroborated by various organizations all over the world. They all point to a similar trend. And we can see the differences may be very slight, especially going back to 1850s. But one thing that humans have been very good at measuring for a long time is temperature. But again, it's very hard to say, and we're talking about on a global scale. But as we get closer and closer to modern day, our technology gets better, and we get more accurate, and we can see basically uniform results. So without human activity, the exchange of carbon between Earth's surface and atmosphere is, like we said, in a steady state. Inputs equals outputs. Burning fossil fuels, this combustion leads to increased CO2 in the atmosphere. So CO2 concentrations was steady at approximately 280 parts per million between 1600 and 1800. However, between 1800 and present, again, various things, including the Industrial Revolution and the changing of Western lifestyles, has contributed immensely to this. CO2 concentrations increased to 420 parts per million today. So it's an immense increase in the concentration of this gas. And just like we saw in our book that we read over the summer, we know that carbon dioxide retains more heat than other gases. And therefore, if we have more of that gas in our atmosphere, more heat will be retained. So tree harvesting in the form of deforestation, trees store a large amount of carbon as wood. Now, cutting and burning these trees releases that stored carbon back into the atmosphere, as opposed to letting the tree fall down, rot, and then that carbon is returned to the environment. Some will be released by decomposers, but the rest of it will eventually just be returned to the soil. The current evidence points to increasing CO2 in the atmosphere during the last 2 centuries is heavily linked to human activities. Again, we have to use the scientific perspective. We have to look at the data unbiased and say, we see that this global rising trend. We know that carbon dioxide retains this heat energy. We know that the heat energy is increasing and that the amount of carbon dioxide being released is increasing. There is a correlation there, and most data is pointing towards that being a direct correlation. They're showing causation. It's merely beyond speculation at this point, but again, we always have to keep our minds open. So this leads to an increase in global temperatures known commonly as global warming. Climate change and global warming are not the same thing, but they are intertwined with each other. And we can see here a diagram demonstrating the relationship between carbon dioxide emissions as well as over time going from 1750 up until modern day. So we're seeing that the amount of carbon retained in the atmosphere is increasing as the amount that we release is increasing as well.